There have been some days gone by when I haven't thought about Bristol, but I often do think about Bristol and how things might have turned out, but not with regret or rancor, just I've brought up two Australian kids. I've had a life in Australia that I wouldn't otherwise have had. I see myself as having had opportunities to lead and develop services that I've really loved doing. And I don't think I could have stayed in Bristol with what had happened in Bristol. It just would not have been possible. The first time I realised there was something badly wrong in Bristol was actually on the first day that I worked there. And I did a day of paediatric cardiac surgery with James Wishart, and the two cases that we did that day would normally have taken probably a morning at the Brompton Hospital, and I didn't get home until after 9 o'clock at night. And Maggie said, "That's a long day, what's happened?" And I said, "Well, it just seemed to take them an incredibly long time, and I'm going to have to go back in after my supper and check these kids because neither of them are very well because they've just had such a long operation." So on my first day, there were, I won't say alarm bells ringing, but I could see flags being waved about the duration of the operations. When you're operating on the heart, you're cutting off the blood supply to the heart and it starts to die. And obviously the longer you take when there is no blood supply to the heart, then the less likely the heart is to work well after the operation. So time is crucially important in paediatric cardiac surgery. That was something that I'd learnt at Great Ormond Street and the Brompton hospitals. And in Bristol, time didn't seem to be important. These operations were taking much, much longer and the children were in much worse condition afterwards. We were mortified, everybody, the whole team, particularly the theatre nurses, obviously, who were laying out children on the operating table, were just desperately unhappy with that outcome whenever it occurred. It's not what they'd been paid to do, it's not what they saw their job as, and they, like me, were aware of the fact that things could be better. And they wanted things to be better, and they wanted somebody to try and do something about it. One of the major problems was that the senior surgeon who was involved was becoming an increasingly powerful figure within the hospital. He went from being the senior paediatric surgeon to being the senior cardiac surgeon to being the director of cardiac surgery to being the chairman of the hospital medical committee. So he represented all the consultants at board level for the hospital, and then he became the medical director of the trust. So he became a figure who was relatively unchallengeable, but he also became a very influential figure who people didn't want offside, because if they wanted to become promoted within the organisation, if they wanted advancement through the NHS Merit Award system, then obviously they had to get James Wishart's imprimatur, and therefore they didn't want to fall out with him. So criticising this guy became increasingly difficult. There were a whole core of people who were aware of the problems in Bristol but were unable to bring any pressure to bear on this medical director. When I had first written to John Roylance in 1990, one of the responses had been that Mr. Wishart had asked me to see him in his office. He had told me in no uncertain terms that this was not the way to deal with an issue in paediatric cardiac surgery, and if I took steps like that again to raise the issue with him, then my future in Bristol would be curtailed. It was a very clear threat, and I have absolutely no doubt what was intended by that meeting. I was still raising issues internally as late as 1992. There was then a period in which we were gathering more data to try and prove the case irrevocably that this unit should stop doing the dangerous operations. By 1995, I had told the Director of Cardiac Services and also the Professor of Surgery, who was a senior clinician within the organisation. My plan was to tell as many people as I could and just to let them know. But they were all people within the profession. This was something that that just had to be got out there. At the end of the day, 3 presidents of the Royal Colleges were aware of the problems in Bristol, but nothing seemed to be being done about it.
So why, when you're thinking in retrospect, why was nothing done to sort this out?
I don't think anybody knew what to do, to be quite honest with you, Phil. I think that the issue was that there wasn't a mechanism for dealing with this problem. The problems that were happening in the paediatric cardiac surgery service became a part of my life. Maggie, my wife, and I would discuss it most evenings after work. There were times when Maggie would try and put bans on talking about paediatric cardiac surgery. Can't we talk about something else? Why do we have to talk about this? It did dominate my life, and it was a very unpleasant domination, but I had to talk about it with somebody, and Maggie was the one person that I could talk to about it. I think the tipping point was the last arterial switch operation that they carried out on Joshua Loveday, and that was a horrific sequence of events from December 1994 to January 1995, when this small child was essentially sacrificed on the altar of surgical pride, and there was absolutely nothing that either the Department of Health or myself or any of the people that I have talked about could do about it. There was a lot of anger about the fact that the Department of Health knew about this poor record for the arterial switch operation. I think the hospital and I think the clinicians themselves wanted to keep this as their dirty little secret. They really didn't want anybody to know about it, which at the time and in retrospect convinced me that they were aware of how immoral what they were doing was. We had no record of doing those operations. It was a huge, completely unnecessary gamble with a young boy's life. I went home to Maggie and we discussed the options of me speaking to the parents and concluded that I would be struck off the medical register for criticising a colleague. Maggie said, well, in that case, I'll do it. I'll go and talk to them. And they said, well, I said, you will lose your nursing registration and they will think you're a mad nurse. There's no benefit to be gained from that. And Maggie and I have pondered many times whether we should have done something more to save Joshua's life. I was very sad, obviously, that another child had died unnecessarily in Bristol, and I was very cross that the organisation and that the personalities involved had allowed their pride and their stupidity to allow a child to die. It was just awful. What happened was that a paediatric cardiac surgeon and a paediatric cardiologist came to Bristol. They conducted an inquiry at which they concluded that Mr. Wishart was a higher risk surgeon and that Mr. Dasmana should stop doing the arterial switch operation until he was competent at doing them and had retrained effectively.
This is what you've been saying for years.
Oh, absolutely, yes. They confirmed just about everything I said. And the trust was supposed to release this document to the local press because that was the undertaking they had given the Department of Health. John Roylance came back from his overseas holiday. He decided that this document was far too explosive to release to the local press, and so he arranged for a rewritten version. And the rewritten version said that the surgeons were actually competent and that the problem was the concerns of an anaesthetist had raised the anxiety levels of the surgeons to the point at which they couldn't operate properly. And at that point, I said, I also want to speak to the press because my name has now been brought into this and I don't think this is a realistic representation of what's happening. And so I spoke to BBC television in the West Country and put forward my view that we did have a serious problem with paediatric cardiac surgery. I applied for jobs in Oxford and Nottingham and Southampton. After one of the interviews, I was told by a member of the interview panel that I was probably not employable in England because people knew that I had raised concerns about mortality rates for paediatric cardiac surgery. Her response to me was memorable and at that time for me absolutely incredible. She just said, well, that sounds like an excellent qualification for the job that we have in mind. And that was the first time a healthcare manager or a healthcare official of any kind had actually expressed any endorsement or encouragement for what I'd been doing in Bristol. Whenever I hear of these problems of people who legitimately raise concerns with CEOs and medical directors who not only don't take any notice but actually actively undermine the people who are raising the concerns, my initial response is huge disappointment because what it's likely to end up in is unnecessary deaths of patients in the health service. And I've been through enough of that to know that that's not a pleasant experience, and it's even worse for the relatives of the people that are involved. So huge disappointment. And then I think my secondary response is just a lot of anger. And I direct my anger at the people who are taking responsibility for the performance of the health service. And that's not the patients, it's sometimes the doctors, but it's actually the people at the top of the NHS who are completely failing to take any kind of accountability for what are persistent and unacceptable failings in their organisation. They wouldn't survive in a toy shop, but they survive in the NHS.
Would you do it again, second time round?
Absolutely. I might do it slightly differently, but there's no doubt in my mind that I would do the same thing again if I saw the same thing happening again.